If you've been paying attention to the warnings of King's College London academic David Betts in his very sober Canadian tone, and I'm sure he's commiserating over today's election results, but by the by, you will have noticed that in his interviews with Louise Perry or Peter Whittle over at the New Culture Forum, he has warned about the inevitability of a civil war in Britain. He wrote a very foreboding article in a military strategy magazine, I believe in 2023, about this, and has subsequently explained that the government in the UK, by implementing a two-tier society through everything from the recent Sentencing Council guidance that was scrapped at the 11th hour to things like the Equality Act, which under Section 149 and the Public Sector Equality Duty make it legal and mandatory to discriminate against the indigenous white British host population, men, heterosexuals and Christians, in order to mandate equality of representation of minority identity groups or protected characteristics across the board. With legislation like this, the native population will be aware of the downgrading of their privileged status in their own country. And so vigilante groups might attack critical infrastructure like substations, the sort we saw set ablaze mysteriously in Heathrow a couple of months ago, or they might clash with Muslim militias, the types that we saw were told to stash their weapons in the mosque, or occupied a roundabout, slashed the tyres on a Sky News van, and lacerated the liver of a pub-goer in Birmingham in the riots that followed the Southport murders last summer. David Betts has been very prescient on these warnings, and I think they represent a legitimate threat to the security of the United Kingdom. But what I think is a greater threat, and is something that Sam Bidwell of the Adam Smith Institute warned about presciently on the 17th of April, is the potential for an India-Pakistan civil war to happen in Britain. Now, for those who don't know, on the 22nd of April, in India-administered Kashmir, there was a terror attack by an Islamist group called Lashkar-e-Taliban. Again, I know my pronunciation's terrible, but I shouldn't have to care about this, but thanks to immigration, I do. And in Kashmir, they killed 26 people and injured 20 more. Now, Kashmir is a disputed territory between India and Pakistan, and the India-Pakistan border flag-raising ceremonies have always been a sort of spectacle of delight. This subcontinental ethnic and religious feud gets to silly levels of performativity, with the Indian military, hanging off of motorcycles in feats of acrobatics, or them outdoing themselves and straining their hamstrings to kick above head height and peacock one another. Gets a bit dangerous, though, when a terror attack happens, because now, Pakistan has suspended all trade with India. They've suspended all flights with India. Narendra Modi, suggesting that somehow the Pakistani government are behind this, said that India will identify, track and punish every terrorist, their handlers and their backers, and we will pursue them to the ends of the earth. Now, I expect nothing less from a country whose nationals have been slaughtered by one of their ethnic and religious adversaries just over the border. We saw the same thing with Israel and Hamas. What we didn't see, of course, in the UK with the Pakistani rape gangs, is the government pursue the perpetrators who preyed upon white English children for racial and religious reasons with equivalent force. And that is actually a condemnation of the English government for betraying their own people, whereas perfectly understandable that the Indians and the Israelis are going after terrorists who would threaten their own people in such an existential fashion. The problem with all of this, now, again, I wouldn't normally care about our former colonies' inability to govern themselves. They're just sort of silly countries on the subcontinent over there, and I would leave them to their own devices. However, thanks to decades of mass migration and a multicultural appeasement strategy, we now have, as of the 2021 census and subsequent post-Brexit years of Boris wave migration, at least legally registered in the country, 3 million Indians and 1.9 million Pakistanis. 1 million Indians, by the way, have come in the last 4 years, and we won't know the numbers for the Labour government until May the 22nd, so we could have even more. And we definitely have more in total, because we know that for a while, Indians were making up a large share of migrants crossing the English Channel in small boats from France, despite India being, well, I'd say a safe country, not at the moment because of the India-Pakistan war, and certainly not if you want food that doesn't want to give you an upset stomach. But by the by, so we've got a large ethno-religious political bloc of both factions, India and Pakistan, settled in the UK for decades, and also lots of new and recent arrivals. And we can see how febrile this ethno-religious tension is, because in 2022, after a cricket match between the two nations, Leicester, one of the UK's major cities, Leicester, Birmingham, Manchester, London, Leeds, they're all majority-minority now. They're all majority non-English, rather. Leicester was made an ungovernable anarchic cesspit because after said cricket match, Hindu and Muslim factions, mainly Pakistani and Indian factions, decided to riot for a month over a cricket match. So a full-scale war between the two countries could ignite even further tensions. And we saw this last Friday, by the way, because there were protests outside the Pakistani embassy where the Indians were waving Indian and Israeli flags, and the Pakistanis were waving Pakistani and Palestinian flags. So it shows that there is an additional layer of international religious and political solidarity that codes one way or the other in this conflict. So you're seeing sort of parallel religious and ethnic blocs emerge in Britain that have been apported against the wishes of the host population, who have voted against mass migration in every election and referendum since 1974 through 2024, and have been punished with unlimited, unwanted levels of migration instead, and will now have to barricade themselves in their homes if said subcontinental ethnic and religious dispute turns into a full-scale civil war in the streets of Britain's cities. And during this protest, and this was quite concerning, this is Colonel Tamir Rahat of the Pakistani military. He was accused of motioning to slit the throats of the protesters. Until then, it was silly fun and games, right? It was a bit of a mix between a protest and a dance-off, which was kind of weird, and it was obnoxious that they were blaring their incomprehensible music in the middle of the streets. It sounded a little bit like that argument between the two taxi drivers, and I think it was Birmingham, that you bloody da-da-da-da-da, expletives that I will censor for YouTube. But point being, it might have been amusing if not for the very real threat from a military official, allegedly, to slit the throats of his ideological enemies. And this does go as high as not just the high commissions of Pakistan and India here, but in the British government itself, because we have very powerful ethno and religious lobbies that have taken root within the British state. And this is because of a large volume of first and second generation Pakistani and Indian MPs and politicians. So, for example, the Conservative Party codes Hindu, or codes Indian. Reason is, of course, they've had some very prominent politicians of Indian heritage. I'm thinking former Chancellor and then Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, or former Home Secretary, now Shadow Foreign Secretary Priti Patel, on whose watch there has been a suspiciously large amount of Indian migration occur. Rishi Sunak, of course, was the first Hindu Prime Minister and first British Asian Prime Minister, and he celebrated Diwali. He is always identified as a British Indian, which is why all of the Indian press, when he was installed, not elected, were celebrating, saying that, the sun has set finally on the British Empire and now an Indian is governing Britain. It's sort of folded back in on itself. And they recognised a sense of ethnic solidarity there, which makes it absurd now that Rishi Sunak is claiming to be as English as you and me because he owns a Labrador and likes Star Wars or something. And then most suspicious was Priti Patel, while Home Secretary was in a Foreign Affairs Select Committee hearing, it might have been after, she was Home Secretary, and she said that, using a quote from Prime Minister Modi, that Britain's Indian diasporas are, quote, living bridges, and she proposed to leverage that demographic into democratic pressure to ensure that the British state aligns more with the Hindutva regime in India's foreign and domestic policy goals. Basically, we've got Indians here, and they can pressure our politicians to do good things for India while in Britain, which obviously means more Indians. And at the last election, this is something as well Sam Bidwell has covered. He's very good on this stuff. You really should read his work on The Critic and over at Knights of the Green Shield on Substack. There was a Hindu manifesto. There's also a Sikh manifesto. I know the British Board of Deputies always puts out a Jewish manifesto. Don't know if they did last election, though. And of course, there is the Muslim Vote Organisation we'll get onto later. So there's all these sort of sectarian lobby groups that have taken root in Britain. But in the Hindu manifesto, which said that it wants to liberalise Indian visas to ensure that the elderly parents and dependents of Indian workers can come over and stay in Britain. Bear in mind, each one costs the British taxpayer £465,000 by the average life expectancy age of 81. And over their lifetime, as we've seen from data from the Netherlands and Denmark, these people are never net tax-paying contributors on average, even if they enter at prime working age. If they're past working age, then they're just a drain on the taxpayer. And I don't suppose they provide much in benefits to the taxpayer in the form of brand new barbershops and vape shops. I think we can do without. We can cut our own hair and smoke our own fruity fluid. Thank you very much. But anyway, the Hindu manifesto demanded that we import more elderly Indians, and this was signed by a Tory candidate called Amit Jogia. Imagine my shock. But then there's also another candidate, Bob Blackburn, I think his name is, white British chap, but because he's in a heavily Indian area, he's been given awards by Indian diaspora lobbying groups. He has pushed for Indian issues in Parliament, and it's because he wants to retain his safe seat. So he's playing the politics of ethnic and religious bloc voting. And so are the Labour Party, as I've covered for Courage Media before. They are petrified of the growth of the sectarian Muslim vote, members of whom were flirting for a while with now proscribed group Hizb ut-Tahrir, who, if you remember, in the immediate aftermath of October the 7th, gathered in the streets of London to call for Muslim armies to rise up for jihad. Not great. Hizb ut-Tahrir also, by the way, were lobbying the Home Office and Prevent to downgrade the recording of Islamophobia, of Islamic terrorism, and calling it Islamophobia, and seem to have been successful. So this Muslim sectarian bloc is very interested in Islamic sectarian issues. The Labour Party are petrified of the growth of this bloc because many of their cabinet ministers, including Jess Phillips, Wes Streeting, their seats, and Shabana Mahmood, their seats are under threat in heavily Muslim areas, and they actually lost one of their shadow ministers, Jonathan Ashworth, who is now making a career of being an apologist for Starmer's government and going around being the Ofcom mandated stooge on GB News. So what the Labour Party are doing is they're prioritising Pakistani sectarian interests, and this is where Tahir Ali, the Right Honourable Member for Mirpur Pakistan, comes in, because he was obviously lobbying using a letter-writing campaign for the British government to help build an airport in Mirpur, Pakistan, the exact region where most of the Pakistani rape gang perpetrators come from, and he also stood up in Parliament at the start of this year asking Keir Starmer to ban the desecration of the texts of the Abrahamic religions. He was calling upon a UN resolution that said that basically burning the Quran is a hate crime, for which people who have done that in protest have been prosecuted in this country and killed in places like Sweden. So he is obviously prioritising sectarian, ethnic and religious concerns, Pakistani Muslim concerns, after he was roundly ridiculed by the likes of yours truly, who ratioed him into the dirt on Twitter by saying we don't want an airport in Mirpur unless it receives more deportations than it does facilitate departures. He then got up in front of a group of Pakistanis in Birmingham, while rubbish is piling high in the streets in his constituency, thanks to the bin strike, and said, we need this airport. Also there was Ayub Khan MP, about whom I wrote on Substack, who said that the Pakistani rape gangs are a false right-wing narrative spread to sow division.
So when the right-wing media and those that seek to undermine, they are using a false narrative. And there's nothing new in that, because we know what they have ran in the past, whether it's in relation to the people that stand up for human rights, for Palestine in Kashmir, whether it's to do with grooming gangs. It's a narrative that is done in order to sow division. And we must prevent that from happening. And one of the ways that we achieve that is to make sure that the moment a false narrative is arisen, that we address it immediately.
No, I think that 80% of the perpetrators being Pakistani Muslims means that there's a disproportionate problem with Pakistani Muslim enclaves in Britain, raping and abusing white working class English girls, denigrating them, subjecting them to torture while they're reading Quran verses at them, calling them white slags, white whores, shouting at ticket conductors when they're caught for riding on the train without paying, many such cases, that white girls are only good for one thing. As recent transcripts read out in Parliament by Katie Lamb have found, one Pakistani perpetrator said, we're here to F white girls and F the government, meaning there's a transparently political angle to these crimes. But no, Ayub Khan is willing to downplay them because of ethnic and religious solidarity with the perpetrators and with, of course, the family members who have covered up their crimes, who have said to Yasmin Ali Harbi Brown that the white girls basically brought it upon themselves because the way they dress, by Allah, is shameful. Or of course, during the trial in 2024 in Rotherham, Charlie Peters covered this. He was sat in the gallery, and one of the girls, one of the children of the rapists, called out, "I love you, Dad," even after her father was sentenced for all these crimes. So these unrepentant child abusers are doing this for racial and religious reasons. And yet, Ayub Khan, even yesterday in Parliament during the emergency statement with Jess Phillips, got up and said, well, we might want to talk about how all individuals abhor child abuse and The rapists can come from the background of any race, any creed, any religion, and they just have blackened souls. There might be people with blackened souls here, you know. But we must only talk about it in a way which doesn't fan the flames of hate.
Ayub Khan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Child sexual exploitation is a vile and despicable crime that cuts across all sections of our society, perpetrated by individuals with blackened souls. They come from all races, all creeds, religions, backgrounds. All law-abiding citizens want justice for the victims of these horrific acts. Will the Minister agree that our focus must be on supporting the victims of exploitation and on stopping the perpetrators, but that it must be done in such a way that does not fan the flames of hate to innocent groups of people who would, like all law-abiding citizens, condemn these acts?
I mean, of course I agree, and I want to see perpetrators held accountable. What I can say without any doubt, though, that in the past there have been people who have, as other local inquiries have told us, that people have covered up for seemingly, whether asked to or not, multicultural reasons, and that cannot stand. That said, we will always follow the facts and make sure that we are dealing completely and utterly with that.
Now, even Jess Phillips, who looks haggard now because I think the weight of her conscience is bringing itself to bear on her, even she said, look, the exact chilling effect you're perpetuating around the racial and religious taboos about the Pakistani rape gangs is the reason it was covered up for so long, so we can't afford to do this if we want justice for the victims. But the only reason that had such purchase in Britain, this is my point, is because of the powerful Pakistani lobbying groups who embedded themselves in local councils, who have sympathetic MPs, who had members of the House of Lords, one of whom was convicted for child rape, by the way. Without that, they wouldn't have a foothold in politics to ensure that that chilling effect stops any conversations or actions around the Pakistani rape gang, to ensure that vast amounts of foreign aid is still funneled to Pakistan despite them giving the death penalty for Christian apostates from Islam. And so all of this is pertinent to the fact that if an Indian and Pakistani civil war kicks off, particularly over the issue of Kashmir, by the way, because Kashmir, an independent Kashmir, if you deny an independent Kashmir, that's decreed Islamophobic under the guidance set forth by the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Islamophobia, which the current sitting Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, helped write with Hope Not Hate, lying communist activist group. It was adopted by Camden Council, as well as 49 other councils. And in there, they said the denial of an independent Palestine and an independent Kashmir is itself Islamophobic. So if we're signing up to these sort of Islamophobia blasphemy laws to run our country, and we have a large diaspora of politically active Pakistanis, with Scottish Labour leader Anas Sarwar saying that Pakistanis need to use the Labour Party as its vehicle to ascend to positions of leadership and then work in Pakistani interests at a recent conference, if we have that, then if a war breaks out between Indian and Pakistani citizens, who can all vote, by the way, because of the 1948 British Nationality Act allowing Commonwealth citizens to vote even if they're not British citizens, then that means that we could have factions of street rioters on both India and Pakistan sides, and the state split down the middle with independent Muslim candidates and the Labour Party desperately stopping the Muslim vote from breaking for them, siding with Pakistan, or at least coding Pakistani as they code Palestine. And the Conservative Party, now that David Cameron doesn't have his finger on any levers of foreign influence, the Conservative Party coding Hindutva, coding Indian and coding Israeli. And so this could spill over, essentially, into a large-scale ethno-conflict that doesn't involve the British host population who didn't want them here in the first place at all. Very concerning. Personally, I think, we don't have to tolerate any of this. We could just shut down foreign lobbying. We could stop mass immigration. We could make it a very unwelcome place to live in Britain for such extensive foreign lobbying efforts. But instead, our politicians have chosen another path for us. So very frustrating. Meanwhile, the Met Police I decided to do training exercises in their Gravesend facility for upcoming summer riots. The Ministry of Justice has made more prison places available for anticipated summer riots, like in 2024 when they locked up non-violent protesters like Peter Lynch and people who made ill-advised X and Facebook posts like Judy Sweeney or Lucy Connolly for the crime of being upset about Axel Rudibkana murdering Rita Cabana, murdering 3 girls and stabbing 10 more at Taylor Swift dance class in Southport. Instead, the Met Police have decided during their riot training to confront people dressed up in Union Jack flags. Don't worry, they said, after I and a few others tweeted about this on Twitter, brought a lot of attention to it, they said, and I quote, "The Union flag being there was entirely coincidental." Are you sure about that? Reminder, Mohammed Kosbar, one of the Met Police's Muslim community advisors, had to be sacked in February of 2024 because he praised Hamas as master of the martyrs of the resistance. So that explains why they might be enacting two-tier policing around Palestine marches versus a few British people getting pretty upset about dead girls, and why they're now preparing themselves to set the security state against the native population, even though the threat of an India-Pakistan civil war in Britain's streets is a much greater risk. And also, the Met Police said, "It is disappointing we are increasingly having to challenge this sort of misinformation, which only serves to increase divisions and tensions." I think the only thing increasing divisions and tensions here is the world historical levels of mass third world migration and the importing of tribal minorities who either hijack the democratic system and vote along the lines of ethnic and religious blocs, whereas the indigenous host population vote along individual lines for parties and political topics. Or, if they don't get their way, they riot in the streets and recreate the conditions of a third world hellhole by either piling rubbish dysfunctionally up in Birmingham or setting light to shops and beating each other with sticks in Leicester. We could choose another path. Unfortunately, our political elite have decided against this.